Hello and welcome to Volume 2 of this three-part series on the Perk. I'm International Master Andrew Martin. On this particular volume we'll be looking at some very important systems that White can play against Perk's defence. Let's get to the basic position after G6. And now the first of these systems is the G3 system. This can't be underestimated. Black must treat this with great respect. White's play in this variation creeps up on Black and can often lead to a devastating kingside attack, despite the immediate impression that White's play is nothing special. White can also introduce the G3 variation via 4 knight GE2, followed by G3. In fact, this might be White's most accurate path to get into the G3 system. I repeat, Black must be on the ball against this variation. Going back to G6, we'll also be looking at the rather crude attacking line where White puts his bishop out on C4, possibly followed by Queen E2 and E5. In my view, this is one of White's least dangerous variations against the Perk, and Black has plenty of adequate ways to meet it, as we will see. Going back to G6, we then come to another very dangerous system, Bishop G5, and I'll be treating this variation in some detail. This is the Byrne variation, named after the American Grandmaster, and well, it's a very fluid attacking concept. White's idea is based around Queen D2, creating a battery of bishop and queen, and then the subsequent bishop H6. White may also play F4 with the dark square bishop outside the pawn chain. Well, once again, Black has to treat this variation with great respect and care, and I'll be showing you how to do this a little bit later on. Finally, and tying up a few loose ends, we'll look at the very rare move Bishop F4. Again, this is not a particularly dangerous line, but Black has to know what to do against it, as in all Perk variations. Okay, well that's the intro. Now it's time for the substance. Well, to start DVD2, I'm going to consider what outwardly looks like an unpretentious system for White against the Perk. But in reality, which is actually a very dangerous way to play, and Black must be fully prepared to meet this system. And that's the line where White fianchettos the king bishop. Now, in our feature game, Anna Ushenina, female grandmaster, versus Alexander Arashchenko, which was played in the Ukrainian Championship in 2005, White starts off with 1G3. And there are obviously various ways to transpose to the given position. But we're just going to play a few more moves out in this game to get to our featured position, and you'll see that this could easily have arisen from the Perk move order. In other words, White plays 3 knight C3, G6, and then Black gets to this position naturally. And I think this is a model game by Black, actually, because he shows how it's possible to muster counterplay. I think that's the main strength of White's system. Black is really denied immediate counterplay because White's not trying for too much in the centre. White's just building up modestly in the centre, and he's going to continue with moves like H3, preparing Bishop E3, castles, Queen D2, and then he's going to think about ways to divert the Queen's rook, or maybe even to advance on the Queen side with A4 to cramp Black. And against this, because Black's got slightly less space, it's not at all easy to muster active counterplay. So Ushenina's next move is very much in keeping with the system. The simple H3, denying Black the G4 square, and preparing Bishop E3. It really is as simple as that. So how is Black going to get counterplay against this insidious system? Well, Arashchenko shows one way. He takes on D4, and it's the way I'm recommending, and then just plays his knight out to C6. White plays Bishop E3, and now the simple move Bishop D7. So unpretentious play by Black to start with. You know, in the Perk and the modern defence, there's enough flexibility, enough room for experimentation. I mean, I think that's why a lot of players like these hypermodern defences, because you can fashion counterplay to your own specifications. But against this particular system from White, I think it's far more difficult because, well, the pawn on E4 is the only target really, and that seems solidly protected. Nevertheless, in this game, Black shows it is possible to muster counterplay against this pawn on E4, and that forms the basis for his whole middle game plan. So Rook E8 is very much a thematic move. Well, King H2 anticipates Black's next move, Queen to C8, and now White plays modestly Rook E1. I don't think the move Queen D2 would change things very much. Probably against that, Black would take on D4 and go Bishop C6 as he does in the game. In actual fact, after rook e1, Aryshchenko plays a6 first, and then after f4, he goes rook e7. So rook e7 gives us the first sign of activity to come. Black is planning to take on d4, to play the bishop to c6, to play the queen up to d7, and then to swing his rook across to e8. g4. So Ushenina seems to be delaying bringing her queen into the game. As I say, normally you'd be expecting white to play queen d2 in a position like this, but rook e1 is also slightly unusual. g4, however, is very much in keeping with the overall aim of this line. To cramp black in the centre, to deny counterplay, and then to start a kingside pawn roller going. Well, okay, knight takes d4. A reaction on the flank is worth a reaction in the centre, so that's exactly what Aryshchenko does. He mounts counterplay thematically against the e-pawn. So I would say this is a fairly standard way to muster the black forces, and it should be taken on board. Take a look at those double rooks, the knight and the bishop, all pounding down at the pawn at e4. This has to be the way to go for black in this system. Okay, white defends. And now that very interesting move here, h6. I think black is anticipating the kingside pawn storm with this move. He's dissuading white from playing g5. And he's also preparing g5 himself, which, well, as the game continues, turns out to be a very dangerous thrust. But first of all, as befits a grandmaster, black strengthens his position carefully with a5 and b6. White sees the opportunity to advance on the queen side. Black takes and now strikes hard at the white pawn chain with g5. This is a very good move. It's a model game by black, really, because it shows how, from a position where there seems to be nothing, black is able to work up counter chances. And clearly, with the e5 square now falling into black's hands, I don't think black is in any danger anymore in this position. White played queen d2. Black was happy to take on f4. Knight h7. So there was a trade on g7, but this trade is a good one for black because it makes the bishop on f3 look very poor. Moreover, black has control of g5 and e5, and that is going to keep him on the board. And more than that, actually enable him to try to play for the win. White played bishop g2, black played queen e6, and with that move, black is now thinking about playing queen to c4, which gets the queen into a very active location. And as the game continues, this is exactly how Aryshchenko plays it. White is really hampered now by the uncomfortable position of the pawn on e4. That really is cramping his style in this position. The bishop on g2 isn't very good either. So white now suddenly is positionally worse, and black transfers his knight into the centre. Now comes queen to d4. It's all about control of dark squares. Black does not want to exchange the queens in this position. Instead, he's retaining the queen for activity against the king. Knight comes into d5. There was a check. The king went to h3. And there was another brilliant move now. Knight g5 check. Possibly Ushenina overlooked this move, but now the threat of rook h8 is incredibly strong. And this obliges white to return the piece with knight f6. Which brings us back to our original theme of black controlling the dark squares in the centre, and in particular, that pawn on e4 looks very weak. So white is still struggling, despite the simplification. She tries to get her pieces into active locations. Meanwhile, black steadily improves his position. He brings his rook up to e5, forcing one of the white rooks passive, and then repositions the rook on d7. So really excellent play. White can do nothing because of black's firm control over e5. Rook b4, very passive as well, but probably necessary. And now rook a4 was answered by bishop c8. Rook a7, rook takes b5. Black can even allow a white rook into c7 here because he's going to play for a bishop endgame with rook c5. A further simplification, c3, king e5. And now the way to judge these endgames is, well, obviously black's a pawn up here. How many pawns have you got on the same colour square as your bishop? Black would be better here anyway, despite notwithstanding the extra pawn, because he's only got one pawn on the same colour square as his bishop, whereas white's got two. Well, the extra pawn, of course, makes this a very easy win, as black now creates a pass pawn on the queen side, and this signs white's death warrant. the bishop will have to look after the b pawn, and then black just moves in and takes off probably both of white's pawns. So I think that was a very thematic game by black. Black played patiently in the opening. He traded on d4, and he mounted pressure against the e4 pawn. The strike with g5, prepared carefully by h6, was also very noteworthy. Very thematic, and excellent play by Aryshchenko. Now, it's obvious that when white deploys his pieces against the Pirc, he's got pretty much a free hand in how he sets them out. And he may just revert to what we call natural methods. He doesn't play any sort of system. He just gets the pieces out and hopes that something's going to turn up. Well, a good example of this in the Bishop G5 system comes from the Corsica Open tournament in 1999 between a French player, Jean-Renaud Lagune, and the Grandmaster Artasius Minassian. And it's useful, finishing off this section on Bishop G5, to just see a game where white plays perhaps the most natural moves in the world. Instead of this f4 business, he just puts his queen on d2, plays his knight out to f3, b5, and now brings the bishop out to d3. We've seen this once before in this section, but perhaps in this game, white plays even more naturally here, just sticking with the move bishop h6. As we know, black should play bishop g4 here, takes on a g7, and now white plays a typical, how can I put it, club player's move here. He just plays queen e3. He's initiated his primary idea of taking off the dark square bishop, and now he just plays his queen up to e3 to avoid any damage to his pawn structure on the king side. Moreover, white can castle on either side. So it's just a temptation to think in this position that black is slightly worse. Well, he may well be infinitesimally worse, but it's going to be instructive to see how Minassian handles the black side and comes out on top in the end. In actual fact, in reality, I don't think white has any sort of significant advantage here whatsoever, and it's an integral component of black's plan to take off that knight, to get rid of this pesky bishop which can get in the way, clog up the development of the queen side, and now to stake a claim in the centre with e5. So this is a good way to play the position as black, and as you can see, he's avoided any congestion. He's got some nice space on the queen side due to the pawn on b5, and the pawn on e5 has enabled him to establish this foothold in the centre. So black has equalised, and now the question is, what does he do with it? Well, white may have some positional problems here, and they come from this bishop on d3. You really don't want a bishop in your position looking at a central pawn the whole game. The bishop on d3 is very good protecting that pawn on e4, but in all other respects it's poorly placed. It's blocking the d-file, stopping a white rook from coming into the game. So it makes sense for white to try and get that bishop somehow into the game. So if I was white, I would certainly be thinking about a move like a4, trying to get that bishop going, or maybe even c4, which explains black's next move, excellent move, rook b8. That move is prophylaxis against c4 and a4. It forces white to think about his queen side before he can get this bishop going. So very good from Minassian there. White goes c3, and now black plays c5, and now we see another point to the move rook b8. The rook necessarily protects the b pawn as a prelude to c5. Now black is thinking about counterplay on the queen side with moves like queen b6 and then maybe b4. So white's position, it seems to me, over the last few moves has got slightly worse. Black's position seems to be getting better and better, move by move, and that is the hallmark of the strong player. They seem to be able to coordinate their pieces so as to improve their position move by move. Well, white pushes on, making his bishop ever worse, and now black continues to improve his game with c4 and knight c5. In a way, this highlights a very good way to play in the middle game when you can't see exactly what to do. I mean, black has no obvious way to proceed. I mean, he can develop, let's say, a plan of gradual improvement of the pieces and an eventual b4, but there's nothing tactical in the position. So Minassian just makes slight improvements, move by move, very slightly improving his position, just not making things worse, and allowing his opponent a bit of rope. I mean, the white player in this game is not weak, but he's not strong either. And so Minassian says, well, I will gradually improve my position. Let's see what you can come up with. And sure enough, given this rope, the weaker player tends to come up with planless play. And that really is what King H1 is all about. I think white has some visions of playing f4 at some point. so he gets the king off the diagonal. That seems a long way off, and black moves in with b4 immediately. And now comes another weak move by white, really. He plays this move g4, which frankly looks poor. Now, of course, white didn't have to play g4, but the fact is black has plenty of counterplay in this position anyway, and well, certainly doesn't stand worse. If anything, I prefer black's position here. But g4 just makes it look horrible, because not only does white have to think about his poor bishop now, he's got to think about the pressure on the queen side. He's also got to think about his self-inflicted weaknesses on the king side. So black moves in with b3, and the point of that is to nail down the pawn at b2. Knight comes to a4 at some point, and that pawn on b2 is gone. So white continues with knight g3. Black takes on a2. g5, lunging forward, hoping for some play. Bishop takes a2, and now queen to a6. And that move is awkward for white, because black's got a double hit on the bishop and the pawn at b2. b4 was played by white. C takes b3. Bishop b1, a rather desperate sequence of moves. The complete absence of play on the king side due to this pathetic bishop and the fact that white's blocked lines there doesn't help either. And white continues to experience severe difficulties now after rook b3. Well, I think white's just lost. Rook g1, is there any threat? Can't see anything. Knight f5 doesn't seem to work. There's no check on f6. Knight h5 doesn't seem to be working. Black moves in for the kill with rook a1. So white basically plays his last card here. He plays knight to f5 check. I mean, he's got to do something like this and hope that, you know, the punch will land. But black just takes it. Grandmasters are pretty cold-blooded. If they can't see any direct threats, they just take things. Queen h5. Knight takes e4. Black's central counterplay is very powerful. Queen h6 check. This is the culmination of white's play. Rook takes e4. Well, rook takes b1. Unfortunately, that is the end of the... Black is going to take on g1 and queen is pawn. So rook takes b1, f takes e4, and this rather miserable experience for white ended here. So that was a typical game, really, where black outplayed white, and it's a good way to end our section on the Burns system, because it just shows you that white just can't rely on his natural development to see him through against the Pirc. Black has counterplay. Points to remember about this game? Well, please do remember the idea of getting rid of this light square bishop. And, you know, even if your fianchetto bishop comes off the board, you've still got a perfectly good game with the central counter e5 and knight bd7. By these means, Menashen was able to outplay Lagunis in this game. Well, I think by now, from the first two games, you should be getting a flavour for how black organises his counterplay in this line. And we're going to take another look now at a Grandmaster game from the Gran Canaria Open in 1997 between Igor Kenkin and Rai Tishbirik. And whereas the last two games have featured 1g3, this time we see the orthodox Pirc move order, and white only plays g3 on move 4. Alright, well, we've seen these moves before. White develops his knight to e2, black plays e5, and now this little move h3, which can prove so useful in many variations. But I think the primary point of h3 is absolutely clear. White is preparing to play bishop e3, and he doesn't want the bishop molested with knight g4. Well, black brings his knight out to c6. White does indeed play bishop e3. Sticks with the tried and trusted plan of taking on d4, bishop d7, and now black will put his rook on e8, hoping to bombard the pawn at e4. And Kenkin plays rook e1. Well, we've seen how quickly the e-pawn can come under fire. Just drop back. I mean, normally white would quite happily leave his rook on f1 in this position, so that when f4 comes, and maybe even g4, the rook is in the right place. But rook e1 is a necessary concession in this position, because black's plan of putting that e-pawn under pressure is actually quite powerful here. Well, Tishbirik plays a6, and whilst that doesn't look like it's contributing in any way to this plan of hitting e4, we only have to consider that black is threatening b5 and then b4 to acknowledge that white should probably take a little bit of time out here to play a4, and that's exactly what Kenkin does. So Kenkin is being forced away from his natural plan for the time being of advancing those kingside pawns, and instead he's trying to put black's position under a little bit of restraint. Well, Tishbirik could take on d4 here and play bishop c6. Instead, he comes out with an original move here, knight a5, and it's a good move too. And, well, the point of it's obvious. I think black wants to play knight c4 at the right moment and embarrass the bishop on e3. But there's far more to this move than that, as black is intending c5 and then bishop c6, renewing the threat to the e4 pawn. So that when white in the game played g4, black played c5, knight e2. Now the point of g4 in this position is to provide a square for the knight on g3, an option white immediately takes after bishop c6, when, as we can see, the only really comfortable way to defend the e-pawn here is to play knight g3, as the move f3, absolutely hideous in this position. So knight g3 was played, black played knight c4, white must play bishop c1 to preserve his bishop, and now d5. So Tishbirik has found a very good way here of equalising the game. He's got his pieces into active locations. By concentrating his fire on that e4 pawn, he's prevented white really from expanding on the king side, and now he creates counterplay in the centre. And clearly if white takes on d5, black will capture on e1 and then take back on d5 in comfort. So white tries tactical moves, bishop f1. Tishbirik is up for a tactical struggle. He plays d4. White takes on c4. That fianchetto bishop has now come to a very peculiar location. D takes c3, and now queen f3. Obviously, Kenkin feels that whether he trades queens or not and then takes on c3, the long diagonal would then be very, very open, and that with the e4 pawn immediately dropping, he feels it's better just to ensure himself against a capture on that square. So queen e7. Queen takes c3. At least this way white avoids damage to the queen side. But knight takes g4 opens up new dangers against the black queen. So black has refused to be intimidated by white's system and has now developed a very active position. Queen b3 was answered by knight e5, and after bishop f1, Tishbirik played the excellent move here, c4. That's a temporary pawn sacrifice. White can take this pawn, but he now gives black really the run of the game. I mean, that light square bishop on c6 is really strong. And, well, after c3, black played queen h4. The problem for white is that black is getting in among the king, and there's a trick in the position which I think both players might have seen, but I don't think King could do much about it here. He played king h2, and now comes the beautiful move queen takes h3. Splendid little tactic there. Discovered attack against the queen, and white gets in with a joke of his own, queen e6. I suppose if he retreated the king, rook takes c4, and then black is doing extremely well with the two bishops. But queen e6 doesn't change much. It's just the move of a man with a sense of humour. f5. Two bishops open it up, nice and active. Some pieces come off the board, but now this bishop, this light square bishop, is just a giant. So black has a massive advantage in this endgame for three separate reasons. Number one, he's got the two bishops. Number two, he's got much the better pawn structure. And number three, he's got a passed pawn. The pawn on h7 is a game winner in this situation. So strong is the advantage here that white cannot hold the position no matter how well he plays. He tries to, how can I put it, reduce the mobility of black's kingside pawns by playing his bishop out to g5 and then h4, back to f2. But g4, it's all about the light square bishop here. And, well, black is light squares for that bishop to start working. Knight d2 was answered by g takes f3 check, and king g3 by rook f5. Knight c4 was answered by bishop takes a4, and for the rest of this game it's really just a mop-up job. Knight b6 h5 check, king h3, bishop b5, no threats for white. Knight c5, and now rook g5. And with the white king in terrible peril and two pawns down, Kenkin decided to resign. So that was another very good and active game by black in this line, and it shows once again the efficiency of this plan, where black just develops his pieces naturally in the opening, takes on d4, and then who knows, maybe you can, instead of taking on d4, play knight a5 as Tishbirik did here. A bit of light relief coming up now as we go to the Four Nations Chess League, the professional league in England. It's March 2011, and it's the game between Ingrid Lauterbach, a female international master from Germany, now residing in the UK, and Jason McKenna. And it's another terrific example of, well, the hidden ideas that black can bring to bear with his system. Okay, well, Lauterbach comes out with the normal moves, and we've seen all these moves before. Knight comes to c6, and now black challenges in the centre with e5. Bishop e3, e takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop d7, white castles, rook e8. And now Lauterbach makes a mysterious move. She plays a knight to e2. Well, we can see the motivation behind this. She doesn't want to play rook e1. That's absolutely clear. She wants to leave the rook on f1 to support the kingside pawn advance. So a likely plan for white is g4, knight g3. Black plays a6, and now I think probably white should just play either g4 or a4 in this position, because queen d2 is most unsuccessful. In fact, it's one natural move too many here by white, and after knight e5, white falls into immediate difficulties. There are two threats. The first threat Lauterbach deals with. The second threat, I think, must have come as an incredible shock to her. Bishop takes h3. And this is a move actually which wins the game immediately. It wins a pawn for nothing. Obviously white can't take this bishop. Knight f3 check wins the poorly placed white queen. And already Lauterbach was down to bishop g5. Queen d7 was played, rook a d1, but it really is misery all the way now for white. She played f3, black played b4. Knight a4 shows her unwillingness to exchange pieces, but it just leads Lauterbach into further difficulty. After the crunching sacrifice, knight takes f3. Rook takes f3, knight takes e4. Queen d5, keeping in touch with the bishop. But now knight takes g5. And Lauterbach is suddenly completely routed, as the knight on e2 is on pre. Well, I did say this was only a brief game, so let's just run through it now to the end. We'll take a look at another better game than this next up. King f1, rook a b8, rook e1. I'm completely losing for white here. Black coordinates his pieces very well indeed, giving back a pawn. Queen c6, knight comes into e4, that is the problem, and then knight takes g3 check. So this all stemmed from this little position here where black played a6. I think queen d2 is premature in this position, that's absolutely clear. And as I say, white's got to settle for a4 or g4. But if a female international master can fall in for this trap, then so can your opponents. You may have noticed that in the main line, white has the opportunity to exchange on e5 at a certain moment. And there are many club players who will play this bailout idea. We now come to a game from the Tehran Zonal in 2001 between Ali Amjad, who's grades 2-3-60, and Grandmaster Mohammed Al-Modiaki. White in this game seems to be hell-bent on a draw, as after e5, h3, knight c6, he plays the insipid move d takes e5. Now I know a lot of players who will immediately become depressed about the thought of having to take back with the pawn in this position. I think taking back with the knight here allows white the free move f4. So Al-Modiaki takes back with the pawn, and the queens come off in a flash. But you know, if you play the Perk or the King's Indian, you shouldn't be too worried about these queen exchanges. Basically, they give black easy equality right from the outset. Black usually has to struggle more than this to get an equal game in chess, especially against a good opponent. Now, Ali Amjad is graded 2-3-60. Why he played like this is beyond me. And particularly noteworthy here is the fact that black's king is safe and white's king is stuck in the middle, a feature of the position that immediately becomes apparent after Modiaki's next excellent move here, knight b4. This not only protects d5, it hits c2 as well. And after rook c1, black played h6, and after bishop e3, black played b6. The opportunity to outplay a weaker opponent is always there in the position. You've just got to look for it and be prepared to work for it. I mean, I think black, this position objectively is equal. I mean, let's face it. But I think it's slightly more comfortable to play for black than white because white's king is still stuck in the middle. Well, Amjad decides to change gears now with perhaps an ill-advised move, f4, and black again starts to train his sights on the e-pawn. This seems to be a very common feature of this line, fixing the white pawn or isolating that pawn on e4 and then attacking it with everything he's got. White played king f2 and black played rook e8. Rook cd1, and now this was answered by knight a5. F takes e5, and now Almodiaki played a very good move now, knight h7. And basically here, if knight d5 isn't working, and this is the move white played, then white's whole position is poor. Black is much more active, and he's got the better pawn structure. Both of those e-pawns are likely to fall. Rook a c8, just waiting one move. In the full knowledge, white really can't improve his position. h5 restraining, and now at his convenience, Almodiaki gets the pawn back. Black is much better. Bishop d4 was played, knight c6, and the reason he's better, of course, is very clear. White's got one weak pawn on e4, and black has got no weak pawns. Moreover, the move c6 repels borders, and now rook c7 is going to lead to coordination of the black forces. Rook comes into d6, black played king g7, very slow, white doubled up, and now bishop c8. This was a move prepared by rook c7. If rook d8 now, black plays rook ce7, and again everything is in order. King g1 was answered by knight g5, and h4 just by knight h7. Amjad played a4, and bishop e6 was the last move of the game. Now I don't know whether white lost this game on time. I've got a sneaking suspicion that he did, but well, this is not a resignable position, of course, but of course he's much worse. The pawn on e4 is almost certainly going to fall, and black's upcoming plan is knight f6 and then knight g4. So that was the last move of the game according to my database. Black wins. Just dropping back and reviewing this opening, I think we can safely say d takes e5 is insipid. So one more time through the opening moves. Okay, we get to the main line position. How should we describe black's plan? Okay, point number one, challenging the centre with e5. Point number two, you're looking to play knight c6 with simple development in mind. If you can take on d4 and go to work against white's e-pawn, then please do so. The e-pawn, the pawn on e4, should be the focus of your attention. You are planning to make white's light square bishop bad, and none of the examples we have seen did that light square bishop contribute in any way, shape or form to a white initiative. Basically, I think this g3 system is relatively easy to equalise against and to develop active play against, but you have to know exactly what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing, you can come into trouble very quickly. So Perk players should not be afraid of g3, but they should give it due respect. Well, now we move on to the line where white plays an early bishop c4, which is not especially effective against the Perk move order, but which could be dangerous if you're not prepared for it. The main line begins bishop c4, black as usual plays bishop g7, and now white plays queen to e2. So it's pretty easy to understand that when white sets up like this, he's thinking about ploughing ahead with the move e5 as quickly as he can. And e5 is the move black has to be careful about. So for instance, if black just casually castled in this position, then I think e5 might be very good for white, with e6 to come. So it turns out that knight c6 is black's best move in this position, with an immediate attack against the pawn on d4. And this is the main line. Well, first of all, we're going to take a look at e5, because this is the sort of thing they do at club level. It's white's most direct attacking attempt, and black must be careful against it. White intends, if allowed, to sacrifice the queen in this position. Black can play knight takes d4 when white is going to take on f6 with the pawn. He gets 3 minor pieces of the queen. I don't want to get involved in this variation. Instead, I want to play a nice solid move here, knight to d7, asking white how he's going to defend his centre. And this will be the subject of our examination. My first game comes from the Moscow Olympiad in 1994 between Aloysius Kvenis and Jonathan Spielman, two strong grandmasters. And after knight d7, white played knight f3. Now, just going back, it might look as though black is setting himself up to be tricked here after bishop takes f7 check. Well, after that, I intend to take the bishop, and if e6 check, then I think king e8. If white takes on d7, black recaptures with the bishop, and everything is in order. Basically, this line isn't anything special for white. Well, I think he may even be slightly worse in this position. So Kreinis goes knight f3. Spielmann played knight b6. Bishop comes back to b3. And now black castles. So black is certainly thinking about intensifying the pressure on white's centre here by playing bishop g4. And that's why Kreinis plays h3. Now comes a very thematic move in this position. And I think it's the best one too. The solid move, knight a5. Spielmann moves in to eliminate the dangerous light square bishop. And it's easy play of this type that lead me to believe this is not a dangerous variation for black to have to face. Indeed, I wouldn't say it's gone out of use at Grandmaster level, but there are not many really strong players who adopt it. Well, Kreinis castled, and Spielmann just took a little bit of time out with h6 to presumably prevent moves like knight or bishop to g5. Kreinis put his knight on e4, and Spielmann took the bishop. A takes b6, f6. Normally, moves like f6 and h6 would weaken the king side. In this specific situation, with white having an absence of light square control and no real way to exploit the weak pawn on g6, then this is perfectly permissible, and indeed thematic, as black moves in to eliminate white's centre. Kreinis played c4, and black took on e5 with the f-pawn, opening up his rook, and then brought his knight back to d7. In positions of this type, which really are very similar to Alekhine's defence, the knight on b6 can often end up out of play. So I urge you to consider the plight of this knight, if you ever get a position like this. Spielmann understands that there's nothing really going on here, white doesn't have any threats, so he can take a little bit of time out to reposition the knight. Well, black has a good game. He's got excellent prospects on the light squares. He's got a light square bishop, which white doesn't have. And I think white's pawns are slightly worse. Black's only slight source of concern here is the kingside pawn structure. But there doesn't seem to be any way for white to be able to attack that pawn structure very easily. Moreover, black is putting pressure on the e5 pawn. No doubt after long thought, Kreinis decided to offer black the chance to take the e-pawn here with bishop d2. And he's basing his idea that if black takes twice on e5 with a piece, then bishop takes h6 will be available at the end. So once again, Spielmann, as is his style, settles for a solid move. Spielmann is basically an extremely good tactical player. He's got a remarkable flair for combinations, but he tends to play very quietly, as quite often the great tacticians do. Petrosian was perhaps the greatest tactician of all time, but you never know it from his games. Instead, what you see is this guy placidly playing chess. But what in fact he's doing, he's controlling the game. And controlling the game is extremely difficult to do at the highest level because your opponent's always trying to do something to you. b6 is one of those prophylactic moves. It's just trying to take the sting out of white's position, and it's keeping options open for the bishop on c8. Maybe that bishop will stay on c8 and monitor the diagonal to h3. Maybe it'll go to b7. White decides to bite the bullet and go e6. And black played knight f6. Knight takes f6, and now a forced move, rook takes f6. It wasn't possible to take with the bishop, nor the pawn. Knight comes to d4, and now that pawn on e6 is gumming up the bishop on c8, so bishop b7 is just a very good location for that piece. Bishop c3, and now another prophylactic move by Spielmann, a6, just cutting down on the range of the d4 knight. f4, and Spielmann played queen f8, hitting the pawn. Knight c2. Well, this is now a very interesting position coming up. Again, white offers the pawn on f4. Against that, he's intending to get the dark square bishops off the board and hope that this sacrifice will give him compensation. Spielmann, in return, offers a sacrifice himself. I did tell you that Spielmann was a remarkable player when he's allowed to be, and this is an opportunity for him to show what he can do in these sorts of situations. Rather than grab a hot pawn on f4 and give white the initiative, instead he prefers to offer the exchange, which Kvinis accepts, in return for two superb bishops and, well, certainly the chance to take one or maybe more than that, white pawns. So Kvinis is forced onto the defensive. Rooks against bishops, well, the rooks generally win if they've got open files to operate on. But for the time being, black has extremely active pieces, and he's threatening to pick off white pawns at any moment. He's particularly strong on the light squares, as we're going to see. b4 by Kvinis, sensible, just trying to liquidate his weak pawns, and Spielman played queen f5. So the queen gradually adds to the pressure on the light squares. King h2, and now another remarkable move by Spielman, queen to e4. He's actually offering the exchange of queens in this position, the exchange down. And I think he's doing that because white's pawns are so weak. The pawn on c4 is very weak. All of white's pieces are on light squares and are vulnerable to the light square bishop. Kvinis plays rook b e1, and finally Spielman takes off a pawn. Queen takes e4. There are some liquidations here, and now rook takes c4. So players proceeded naturally. The battle for the initiative is in full swing. White's basically trying to open up lines for his rooks, get his pieces into better and better locations. But as you can see, black now has two pawns for the exchange, and he still retained his fantastically strong bishops. Moreover, that pawn on b2 is looking rather lonely. White played b4, and black centralised his rook. White played knight c4, and black again refrained from exchanging. Instead, he played rook g5, and that is an immediate attack against g2. So white's got to take time out to protect g2, and now black plays bishop to d5. Rook f4. Pawn up to b5, knight b6, and now the bishop comes into b3. White is thrashing around with his knight, trying to gain some activity, but then another surprising move by Spielman. Rook f5. And it takes imagination to play in this manner, offering the exchange of rooks in a situation where he's the clear exchange down. Bishop comes to c4, rook e3, and now the bishop comes into d4. White went rook a3, and now Spielman showed why it was important to deflect the rook. He took on e6. White's going to get that pawn on a6 by force, but meantime, black is mustering incredibly strong play in the centre. Now he brings his king up. Well, white would love to get the bishop off the board. No dice, says Spielman. Off comes the pawn, and now bishop comes to d5. Black is basically looking for the best way to activate his central pawns now. Knight a7 was answered by bishop c3, and there was a further liquidation on the queen side. So it's two pawns for the exchange, and once those central pawns start rolling, it's going to be very difficult for white to hold this position. Rook comes to a1. The pawns start creaking into action. There's a check on c5, and now the pawns are doing more than creaking. They're actually starting to come forward, lumbering forward towards the white king. White is really struggling in this position. He can't anchor his knight in the centre. In a position like this, the knight needs stability. There's no real targets in the black camp for the knight or the rook to attack. Meanwhile, black has all the play and slowly but surely gets those pawns moving towards the white king. And that's the story for the rest of this game, really. Black takes his time. White can do nothing really about the eventual advance of these pawns. He's just got to wait and hope that at the end of these sequences he's going to have some sort of tactical idea which is going to save the game. But Spielman's in control of the tactics, as he shows here. Bishop c5, if knight takes f4, check, we go king f5. And white can't play rook a6 there because of bishop b5 check. So white must kill time. Up comes the king, methodic improvement. f3, it had to come to this. The defender should exchange pawns as much as possible. And now white has some chance of a draw. I mean, he's split up the black pawns and he's hoping that he can hold this position. But I'm afraid that his position is too fractured to contemplate holding it. In comes the pawn to f2, king e2, and now once again another very unpleasant move for white to have to face. All the way along the line, black has been able to improve his position. And now comes the rub. Bishop g4 check. White's pieces are split in two. He's got to give up the exchange to save his knight. King h3, and now this is an easily winning endgame for black. And so it proves. The rest of the game is silence as White just struggles on manfully, but in the end he cannot stop the pawns. Let's just see what happens. It's a long, drawn-out struggle, but really there's absolutely no chance. Knight takes d6, the last hope. If bishop takes d6, king takes f2, and it's a draw. But Spielmann understands that h3 just wins immediately. Black's pawn is going to reincarnate. White has no defence. Very good game all the way through by Spielmann. And if we just go back to the opening, queen e2, it looks as though knight c6, e5 and knight d7 is the right way to play this. Black has other moves, but this is the most reliable. The nice thing about the variation we just examined, where black plays knight d7, is that the pressure against White's centre is so intense that something has to give, and something has to give quickly. Let's review it now and take a look at a game between Milan Pacha, graded 2366, and international master Robert Tibensky. And this game was played in the Slovakian Team Championship in 2009. After e5, knight d7 came, and now White played this, well, speculative move, I would say. Bishop takes f7 check. You've always got to judge how much real inconvenience there is to the black king in a position like this. I mentioned in the last take, the Spielmann game, that this wasn't really dangerous to black, and we're now going to see that, well, really, White can't muster any sort of pressure here at all against black's very solid position. The black king is certainly in the middle, yes, but what has White got to attack it with? Moreover, black's threatening the pawn on d4. So Pacha played knight f3, and as expected, as you would expect, black plays bishop g4. Immediately the pawn on d4 is coming under very serious fire. White lurched on with d5, and black put his knight in on d4. Queen came to d3, bishop takes f3, g takes f3, and now queen up to d7, with already an extremely satisfactory position for black. Pacha played knight e2, black took off the knight, and rook f8 was a very logical move. So White really has problems with his pawn structure now, and as long as black is careful and looks out for the move queen b5 check, then, well, I think black is getting ready to move his queen to f5, as and when. White played bishop e3, and black played rook f5, an equally strong attack against the black pawn. White went h4, and black played c6. c4 was answered by b5. Typical play in Perk's defence. Black just chips away at White's centre until the centre falls apart. Well, I don't think White can defend his centre anymore. He took on b5. Black played rook takes d5. B takes c6. Queen takes c6. Rook a c1. And black played queen to b7. Very serious problems for White in this position, and it's all stemmed from the opening variation. White has failed to make any inroads at all against black's king position, and now his queen's under attack and the pawn at b2 is also attacked, and he's got to lose material. Pacha decides to jettison material after queen e4. Of course, black takes on b2 check because he can, and then he replays queen to e5. Queen a4 check was answered by king f8, and king g2 by king g8. So black has even managed to artificially castle in this position. White still has no threats whatsoever. Bishop g5 was answered by the sharp rook f8. Black's now thinking of direct attack against the white king. White played rook c7, and black played rook a5. Queen b3 check, and now e6. Bishop d2. Rook c5. Rook takes a7, and now the fight for the initiative continued after rook b5, queen e3, and now queen to f5. Throughout this game, White is hampered by the deficiencies in his pawn structure. He tries to put up a serious defence here with queen e4. Black plays rook c5, and after bishop e1, queen f6 was the move. White played rook h3 to try and shore up his pawns, and black played d5 and put his rook on c4. Still, White is feeling the pain on his pawns. Rook takes h4 is interesting, rook f4 is coming, so White tries to liquidate by playing h5. Rook c1. H takes G6, Rook takes E1, G takes H7, King H8. Rook G3 was answered by Bishop G5 and Rook A4 by Queen A1. So black has pursued his ultimate aim to get after white's king. There were some checks, as one might expect. White hopes for a draw. Black is not interested. He's basically a piece up, and he's going to make that advantage tell. After King G4, there came Bishop F6, and now white has the problem of how to get anything here against the king. Rook A6 was answered by E5, and F takes E5 by Bishop takes E5. Rook A5. Rook takes D5. White even gets the chance to get rid of black's last pawn. But his king, unfortunately for him, is just too poorly placed. Bishop H4 check. Rook F5. Bishop takes G3 check. King G5. Bishop H4 check. King F4. Queen H6 check. King E5. And now Bishop F6 check. A very strong intermezzo. White resigned. Just going back then to the opening, and we pick play up at the point where white played E5. I think knight D7 is a very reliable and pretty good response to this aggressive variation by white. Black forces white to do something in this position because of the pressure on the centre. It's obvious that E takes D6 is nothing special for white. The D4 pawn is hanging, and Bishop takes F7 check didn't look that great either. Remember Spielman's play after knight F3, where knight B6 and a subsequent knight A5 seemed very satisfactory. It's no wonder this line has gone out of fashion. We come now to other lines for white in that Bishop C4 variation. The nice thing for black is that there aren't that many of them. The next game I want to show you is a game between Joseph Sanchez, whose grade is 2466, and Marat Zumaev, whose grade is 2509. And this comes from the Creon Open in 2006. The game starts life as a modern, but quickly transposes back to the Perk, and now after Queen E2 we're going Knight C6. Well, with E5 looking rather ineffective, how about Knight F3? That is white's most natural developing move, and it protects the pawn on D4. It's just that in this situation, I think Bishop G4 is simply a good move. Already pressure is being brought to bear against white's centre, and there's a direct threat here of knight takes D4. So Sanchez played Bishop E3, and now we move forward with the straightforward E5. So with easy moves, black has equalised comfortably. I mean, this is not a sequence which is difficult to remember. Black just pins the knight on F3 and plays E5. By these means, he renders the whole white setup ineffective. D takes E5, knight takes E5, Bishop B3, and now black castles. It's rare in the modern defence or Perk defence that black gets as comfortable a game as this so early. Well, it's interesting to see how black moves on with this advantage, as after castles he played a rather unusual move here, Bishop H5. The point of this, I think, is to try to mount permanent pressure against the white pawns. All the same, it is a slightly peculiar move. White played Rook HG1 and black played C6. White played H3, and now with the bishop on H5 it was time to take on F3. G takes F3, Queen to E7. So Zumaev, 2509 player, has played this in a rather unusual way, but it doesn't distract us from the overall impression that black is doing rather well here. Sanchez is struggling to find a middle game plan which has any effectiveness whatsoever due to the weakness of his pawns. He tried Rook G3. Black played Knight D7, and after Bishop G5, black played Bishop F6. White played Queen E3. Black played Rook F E8, Rook DG1, and now pawn up to D5. Knight E2. Well, there are threats in this position for black, notably the threat of D4. So this is why white moves out of the way. Black moves his knight into E5. The knight comes to D4, and now black parks his king in the corner. White goes F4. Black drops the knight back to D7, and after E takes D5, Zumaev goes Queen B4. Quite difficult for white. The queen's on pre, the knight on d4 is on pre. If he takes on f6, knight takes f6, and this hasn't really helped white. Black's pieces are extremely active. Sanchez tries c3, and now there are some exchanges. Rook takes e3, c takes b4, rook e4. D takes c6, and now comes bishop takes d4. For an instant, it looks like white's getting somewhere after c takes d7, but black shows he's got it all under control with f6, bishop h4, and now rook to d8. White plays rook d3, and now there comes a very interesting move, g5. Rook takes g5. Well, if we just drop back, if that is forced in this position, then white's game is very uncomfortable. But I think black is threatening the bishop, he's threatening the pawn on d7, the pawn on f4, numerous ideas, and this prompts white into making this sacrifice. Rook takes d7, and now rook takes d4 is the point. Rook c7 check. Bishop c2. Well, white doesn't really want black to take on d4 with check. And now we get rook e1 check, king d2, rook e2 check, king d3, and rook ec2. It turns out black has calculated this very well indeed. f5 was answered by king g7, and bishop f4 by bishop e2 check, rook e7 check, of course the exchange of rooks, and then rook c4. So, well played by Zhumaev in the end. Now, I wasn't at all sure if we dropped back to castles on the queen side about this move bishop h5. But there's no need for black, of course, to interpret the variation in quite this manner. The fact remains that if we go back even further, we retract to knight f3, the sequence bishop g4, bishop e3 and now e5 gives black a very comfortable game. D takes e5, knight takes e5, bishop b3 castles. Black has a very good position already. His overall plan might be to mount pressure against the kingside pawns or against the pawn at e4. My final game with this line comes from 1975, an old game but still relevant today, and it's between Alexander Tsutsovsky, playing white, and Mikhail Tal, playing black. It's a game played in the Soviet Union at that time. Again, the game starts life as a modern defence, as it so often does in this bishop c4 variation, but we get transposition quickly, both sides playing convenient moves, and now Tal plays bishop g4. Well, we saw in the last game that bishop e3, e5 just gave black too easy a time of it. So is there any mileage in white playing e5? I mean, that should be the reason he puts the queen on e2 in the first place, to get this move e5 in. Well, it turns out that the pressure against black's centre is just too great, and bishop takes f3 forces complications which are favourable to black. And Tal, of course, plays this move. Now in the game, Tsutsovsky plays queen takes f3, but let's take a look at the alternative here, g takes f3, and I'll try and convince you that this is a good position for black. Now the first point to note is that if black plays knight d4 here, knight takes d4, white's going to sack the queen. He's going to go e takes f6, knight takes e2, f takes g7, rook g8, bishop takes e2, rook takes g7. Now, this may well be good for black. In fact, I think it is good for black. It's a pale shadow for white of a variation he can play in the other line, without the knight on f3 and the bishop on g4. This may be good for black, but if we go back to g takes f3, I have the feeling knight d7 may be even better. Not only has black lame white's pawn structure, the pressure against the white pawns is very intense here, which leads us to two lines. If white pushes on with e6, black takes, queen takes, looks scary, but rook f8 just defends against all the threats, and now it's payback time. The pawn on d4 hangs, knight d4 is a serious threat, knight b6 is a threat, rook takes f3 is possibly a threat, it certainly will be, if not now, then soon. White's position is creaking. So going back to knight d7, white may try a sort of speculative sacrifice after bishop takes e3. I think black just confidently takes this pawn. I don't see what's wrong with this. If white takes, he takes with the knight. This seems absolutely fine for him. Going back, if white pushes on, knight d4. Something similar to this happens in the game. And that knight on d4 is just very, very strong. So going back to bishop takes f3, I think probably at this stage, Tsutsovsky realised that he had to play queen takes f3 and answer knight takes d4 with queen takes b7 and hope that it all hangs together. Well, of course, Tau now can play knight takes c2 check. I suppose white plays king d1 and tries to scramble some sort of tactical sequence from the wreckage. Tau sticks with d takes e5. He just takes a central pawn, an extra central pawn, and asks white, well, what are you doing here? I'm just going to castle next. I've got threats of knight takes c2. Where's your compensation? And Tuskowski plays the only real move here, bishop b5 check, which at least has the merit of forcing black to displace his king with king f8. But is it enough here? I very much doubt it. Clear pawn down, and it's easy for black to unravel, as Tau shows. First of all, Tau offers the exchange of queens. White's not interested. Tau offers again. Again, white declines, and quite correctly so. I think the exchange of queens would just make life too easy for black. But c5 is also quite easy. Black's only got one problem to solve here. How does he get his king to safety? And we're going to see Tau solve this problem elegantly as the game continues by just simply finding the right moment to move the bishop to f6. King g7 next. Black's out of the woods. c4 was played. Knight b6, a very strong move. And after knight takes g5, Tau played for coordination with king g7. Yes, white has regained material, but in all other respects, his position is poor. His pieces are uncoordinated, and he hasn't really completed his development. So queen b5 was played, queen a8, bishop e3, and now knight d6. And this is really unpleasant for white. The queen's attacked, the pawn on c4 will be attacked after that. If white goes queen a5, well, black just takes on c4. So in the game, Tuskowski played a rather despairing move. One gets the impression he was somewhat in awe of his opponent. Rook takes d6, e takes d6, knight b3, but Tau just played d5. And after that, white resigned. So whatever one makes of the middle game or the early middle game in that particular encounter, if we just drop back to the opening, I don't think e5 is a threat to black, as is the whole bishop c4 variation, really. I think if we drop back to queen e2, then however white plays it, with the knight on c3 or the knight on f3, knight c6 with the idea of bishop g4 is just very strong. Black gets enough pressure against white's centre in this line to prove that the bishop on c4 is not on the optimal square. We come now to a really important battleground in the Pirc defence, and one that's very topical today, and that is the line where white plays very aggressively with 4 bishop g5. This is known as the Byrne variation, after the American Grandmaster Robert Byrne, and it's a very dangerous system. White has many ideas in placing the bishop on g5, and which are all basically nakedly aggressive. The first idea is to play queen d2 and then bishop h6 as quickly as possible, as usual stripping out the fianchetto bishop, which as we know can be unpleasant for black. The second of the aggressive ideas is to follow up bishop g5 with f4. This, in my view, is quite a severe threat to Pirc's defence. And after that, knight f3, bishop d3, and then a move like e5 with the souped up version of the Austrian attack. So black has to organise his defence and counter-attack very accurately. Now we're going to see some games from the Georgian Grandmaster Merab Gagunashvili, which will help us to understand how black should marshal his forces in this line. And Gagunashvili likes the flexible move c6 here. Basically, the idea behind that is to find useful a move as possible, for the time being delaying bishop to g7. Point is, if white goes queen d2 and then bishop h6, black wants to make as many preparatory moves as possible before he plays the bishop to g7. In this line, essentially, if black plays bishop g7, white will always be thinking about playing bishop h6 after that. So Gagunashvili continues with b5 here, and this will be the starting point for our investigation. Now in the game, Mikhail Agapov versus Merab Gagunashvili, played in the European Team Championship in 2009. White continued with the most frequent move here, bishop d3, and after bishop g7 he goes f4. Black castles, knight f3, and we can safely say this is the main line of the bishop g5 c6 variation, as Gagunashvili moves in with the key idea bishop g4. It is so important for black to play this move in this particular position. To get rid of the queen's bishop will be a gain for black. It will ease his position, and black intends to follow up this idea with queen b6, let's say, and knight bd7 completing development. Black certainly has designs on pressurising the pawn at d4 in this position. That's one of the key ideas, as we will see. Well, you've only got to see one more move in the game to understand what black is trying to do. Castles queen b6, and immediately white has to deal with the threat bishop takes f3 followed by queen takes d4. Now just going back, therefore white has tried other moves in this position. For instance, he tried to blow back away immediately by playing e5 here, but I think after that b4 is a good move. Always watch out for this characteristic counter-attack, and the idea is if white takes on f6, black will take on c3, threatening to take white's queen with check. Obviously then black will get a good game. So white generally plays knight e2 in this position, and now we get the sequence bishop takes f3, g takes f3, and now knight to d5. And now we can see another useful effect of the pawn on b4. It dissuades white from playing c4. So this is a very unbalanced situation. White's got two bishops, and he's got a central pawn wedge. How effective that wedge is, I would be hesitant to say. However, white does have quite a bit of active play. Against that, black's got a strong knight on d5. He's got counter chances against the centre with the help of a move like f6, and he's got a solid position. White has tried bishop c5 here, and then castles on the queen side, but now comes this hit with f6, and then knight d7. And I evaluate this position as unclear. It's very hard to say who's better here. I wouldn't mind taking black though. Black has plenty of chances on the queen side. Going back, well, to bishop g4, white has also tried f5. Against that, I think it's just best to complete development. Knight bd7 and queen b6. Just seems to me white's gone into action with these pawn moves f5 and e5 one move too early, and black has certain counterplay in this position. Now we come back to the game Agupov versus Gagunashvili, and we pick up play after queen b6. Leaving white with this problem: how do I defend my pawn? Well, white went knight e2, and now black played another very incisive move here, e5. And this is a move with tactical implications, as obviously white can take this pawn twice. If he plays knight takes e5 in this position, I think bishop takes e2 is satisfactory. Obviously, if white takes with the queen on e2, we have queen takes d4 check. If he takes with the bishop on e2, we then have knight takes e4. So white played bishop e3. He takes d4, knight recaptured, queen c7, and now it's all about the square e5. If black can nail down that square and occupy, perhaps put a knight on that square, then it will be very hard for white to do anything. And well, white's got the worst pawn structure, as you can see. He's got this isolated pawn on e4, which could become very weak. Against that, I think white has a slight advantage in development, and he's got this attacking opportunity on the queen side, a4, which obliges black to take. And now white also has a decent position with chances against a7. I evaluate this position as equal, but black must stick to his guns here. It's not an automatic equality. Black must certainly concentrate his fire on the centre of the board, nailing down e5, attacking e4. White thought to himself, right, I've got this weakness on a7, I'm going to exchange the queens off. Black was consistent. He played knight to g4, bishop d4, bishop takes d4, knight takes d4, and now the culmination of black's plan over the last few moves, the occupation of the e5 square. White doubles on the pawn, looks good, is good, but black again develops plenty of counterplay here by placing his knights, getting ready for c4. White pushes forward, black plays rook a d8, white goes bishop e4, central counterplay is enabled after knight d4. White takes on a7, rook f e8, and in order for the pawn on e5 not to go west immediately, white goes knight g5. But black is holding the balance here. White has just too many weaknesses here to hold it all together. It even looks as though white is buying time for the move bishop c6 in a moment, but black has knight e2 check, and then rook d2, which eases all pain. White went king e1, black took on b2, and now probably again white thought, right, I'm getting in among black's position here with knight takes f7. But now knight takes c3, and this is problematic for white because there are a lot of pieces on the e-file, and most of them are white. Most of them are ready to be taken. So white forces a draw with knight h6 check. I don't think we can blame him for that. I'm not sure white can achieve anything more than that, simply because black has too many threats. The bishop's hanging, the pawn on e5 is hanging, white's own king is not especially secure in this position, so a mutual balance exists, therefore draw agreed. So summarising, if white goes for the main line, bishop g5, c6, queen d2, and then sets up this aggressive position with f4, castles and now knight f3, I think bishop g4 is a good move, and after that, quick attack against the pawn on d4 is the way, with queen b6. Well, we saw in the last game that Gagunashvili was quite dangerous with this line as black. Now is another game of his, played in the European Championship in Batumi 2002, against the excellent player Vasilios Kotronias, also a Grandmaster. The opening moves we have seen before. Black is playing flexibly with c6 and then b5, delaying bishop g7 for as long as it takes to organise counterplay on the queen side. White sets up very aggressively with bishop d3 and then f4, as he normally does, and Gagunashvili confidently castles. Well, we know now that knight f3 is going to be answered by bishop g4. So in this game, Kotronias plays an intriguing move, a little move on the side of the board, a3, which looks completely meaningless until you understand that with a3, white has prevented black from playing b4. So probably in this position, white's primary threat is e5, pawn up to e5. You'll recall in the last example, black was ready to answer that move with b4. And then if e takes f6, b takes c3. That's not available here. Moreover, white is saying to black, well, you know, if you can't play bishop g4 in this position, what can you play? And so a3 is a functional waiting move. And so strong is the threat of e5 that Gagunashvili feels obliged to take action immediately with h6, bishop h4, and now an equally remarkable move, pawn up to e5. Now, e5 looks impossible at first sight, because what's to stop white from taking twice? Well, in the game, actually, Kotronias takes once on e5. He doesn't play f takes e5. So what can black's intention be after this, what looks like a game-winning move? Well, it turns out, I think, that black can play knight takes e4 in this position. A counter-attack against the queen, and it's necessary that the bishop on h4 is unprotected. So we get the line bishop takes queen, knight takes queen, bishop f6, and then black takes. He has to play knight c4, but then comes bishop takes, pawn takes, castles, bishop e6, knight f3, and now knight d7 with counterplay. It's hard for white to get any advantage from this position. So going back to the game and picking up play after d takes e5, this is why Kotronias strives for more by castling on the queen side. But of course this move is quite dangerous. It gives black plenty of counterplay. He plays knight bd7, knight f3, and now the stabilising move here, queen to e7. So the position in the centre has been stabilised by black, and now he's thinking about direct attack, a5, b4, etc. The move a3 is starting to look a little bit out of place once white castles on the queen side. Now we can take play black to d takes e5 if you like, and say, well, white could continue with a move like knight f3 here. But then black has definite counterplay in this position. He may even be able to just take on f4, and if e5, a move like queen e8 or rook e8. So castles was probably felt to be necessary by Kotronias, but as I say, in the game, black stabilises, and now it's up to white to prove that he's got any advantage. Kotronias takes on e5 and plays bishop e2. That's another unconvincing move. Black plays a5, knight takes e5, queen takes e5, and now bishop g3. Queen e6. And in view of the idea of b4, followed by queen a2 once the knight on c3 moves, and the weakness of the pawn on e4, white is obliged to continue with forcing moves here, e5, and then knight d7. Well, is white's position improving here? I'm not so sure that it is. Black has the threat of just taking off that e-pawn, and there's no real white attack to be seen. So Kotronias is now scratching around looking for chances, and knight e4 looks very dubious after knight takes e5. Not only has black won a pawn, he's also threatening queen a2. So that's why white has to kill a move with king b1. But you can't really sack a pawn in this position and then just start playing quiet moves. So black is able to continue with forcing play as the game continues and remain a pawn up. Bishop e3 was answered by bishop e6 and h4 by b4. H takes g5 and now the very sharp move. B takes a3. G takes h6, bishop takes b2. And now bishop d4. Okay, this is the first direct threat of the game. White's threatening h7, so black blocks him out with f6. White goes h7 anyway. King in the corner. And now white is really up against it. His own attack has been halted, but black's attack is in full swing after c4, rook a, b8. King a2 was a pretty miserable move. c5, bishop takes c5, decoying the bishop. And now bishop takes c4, check was the last move in this excellent game. So going back to the opening and picking up play after castles, just drop back. a3 is a challenging move, but it seems that h6 followed by e5 is a good reply, taking action in the centre. And there's the logic of chess view. A guy makes a move on the side, you make an immediate counter in the centre. Well, Gugunashvili has made a career out of winning with this variation as black. And here's another game he plays against Frederick Katz. This game was played in the Roda Open, somewhere in France in 2008. And it features a slightly different interpretation of the white position. But for the time being, everything is normal. Queen d2, b5 by black, bishop d3, bishop g7. And now white plays a rather slow move here. Knight to d1, a kind of scorched earth policy on the queen side. Perhaps white intends to follow up with f4 a little later on and reposition this knight on e3. Black gets on with the job on the queen side, creating counterplay with a5 and then a4. And now white reveals his hand by playing f4. It's quite striking that Gugunashvili is willing to castle here. He is confident in the stability of his position. He just says, well, you know, it takes your plan a little bit of time to come into shape, especially in this line where you've played the knight to c3, knight d1, knight e3. All these moves cost time, and I'm just going to use that time to get my pieces out. Well, white decides to crack on with e5, and now the knight drops back to e8. The impression is that white is getting a nice bind on the centre, but as usual, black will use the exposed position of the bishop on g5 to get some excellent counterplay together with the key move here, f6. Well, this is a very strong possibility. White has to retreat. I mean, if he takes with the pawn on f6, we recapture with the pawn with plenty of play. So he goes bishop h4, and we play knight b6. White castled, and now knight c7. So black has got the counterplay against the centre. Now he's fixing the white squares, and in particular, he wants to put a knight on d5. And that's exactly what Gugunashvili does. Well, now we reach a position where I think white can't think what to do. He's shot his bolt already, so to speak. He takes on d5. Knight takes d5, and now another strange move. Knight takes d5. It's often the case where an average player of, say, 2300 plays a grandmaster. They end up outplaying themselves. And how can this move justify the amount of time white spent in getting the knight to e3? He spent 3 moves getting that knight to the central square, then he simply exchanges it off and gives black complete dominance of the light squares as a result. Basically, black is slightly better in this position because of his command of the centre. But now I think white should certainly put a rook on e1. He should play a move like rook fe1 in this position without any doubt at all. But I think rook a8, of course, that's a satisfactory reply for black, but I think that's what white should do. In the game, white perhaps slightly prematurely takes on f6, obviously to open up the bishop on g3, and then plays rook fe1. But now rook a8 is even better than it was before. Knight d2 was answered by bishop f7, and queen f3 was answered by rook takes e1 check. And yes, if white takes with the rook, black will certainly take on a2. Thank you very much. Or we may take the queen first, and then take with the bishop on a2. That's a clear pawn. So white has to play an unpalatable move here. Bishop takes e1, after which black gains the file. Queen takes d5, bishop takes d5, didn't help white's cause one jot. Black now has 2 bishops, and much the more active rook. b3, well, at least that enables the rook to move. I mean, it could be that black is threatening bishop takes a2 in this position, as well as rook e2. b3 was answered by f5. So now there are ideas of b4 in the air for black, undermining the entire pawn chain. That's exactly what happens in the game. White gets the king out of harm's way from a check on d4. Black takes, and now comes this undermining move, b4. If c4 now, bishop takes d4. So, knight c4, b takes c3, bishop takes c3, and another classic undermining move, c5. If there was ever a thematic game showing how black dismantles a white centre in the pert modern defences, this is the game. Rook d1, c takes d4. I sense a favourable endgame coming up here, and that's exactly what happens. Well, you can't get more favourable than rook d8. Pinning the bishop against the rook, bishop takes g7, rook takes d1, king e2, and now rook g1 completes the demolition job. White resigned. In that game, Gegunashvili made playing the Perk look like a very easy operation. We all know it's not quite that simple. That is the touchstone of mastery. Well, let's just summarise what we've seen so far. Now, the Byrne variation is obviously a very dangerous and aggressive system for black to have to face. Bishop g5 will usually preface the move queen d2, followed by bishop h6, but white has other aggressive ideas to involving f4 and then e5. Or, as we're about to see, he may also dispense with the move f4 in favour of just getting the pieces out. After all, bishop g5 and queen d2, what could be more natural than playing these moves, a battery against the fianchettoed black bishop? Black should keep it flexible. His main way of getting counterplay initially is via c6 and then b5. This is why white is obliged in this particular position to play bishop d3, because black's threatening b4. Then comes bishop g4. This is another important component in black's plan of counterplay. Black threatens to downgrade white's pawns with bishop takes f3, and just by snapping off the knight in certain situations, he can take a lot of the sting out of white's attack. Finally, black must not be in too much of a hurry to castle in this line, unless he's absolutely sure he can cope with advances in the centre like e5 and f5, or the automatic attacking plan. Now, the reason this coming game is so vulnerable is that white plays, well, the most natural moves in the world here, and especially this idea with bishop h6. This is the first time we're seeing it so directly. Sergeyev's response is very interesting. He takes the bishop. He's willing to let the queen into h6. He takes on f3, downgrading the pawns, and now comes the flexible move, knight bd7, and after castles, queen b6. So by delaying castling, black has left the option open of evacuating his king to the queen side, and as you can see, white has pawn weaknesses to nurse. So already I think in this position, black has to a degree outplayed his opponent. And now white has got to think, well, how am I going to get my counterplay together? I mean, I think black is going to play castles on the queen side and e5, given half chance. Seeing e5 coming up then, white decides to stop it, or thinks he stops it, by playing f4. But black goes through with e5 anyway, as it turns out. Sergeyev has calculated this variation very accurately, and he intends to answer this double capture with knight g4. Well, white executes his threat. I mean, it doesn't come more natural than this, obliging black to sacrifice a pawn. But white has a lot of weaknesses here. The e5 pawn's weak. Black's threatening knight takes f2, winning the exchange. So it's not that easy for white to hold this position, despite the fact his queen looks in the middle of black's guts, and white's won a pawn on the face of it. Rook d2 was answered by knight takes e5. Again, we see black heading for this e5 square without delay to nail down his central position. After bishop e2, there came rook d2. Another very interesting move because it leaves the rook on h8 to be taken with check. There was a capture on g4, a capture on h8, and now white played queen takes h7. These are all forced moves, and now in comes black with queen takes f2. Queen h3 was answered by queen d2 check, and king b1 by f5. Sergeyev is in a hurry to keep that knight on g4. It's a very powerful piece. And, well, now the threat of knight f2 is renewed. Basically, this is a normal position, but black is playing with an extra rook for the time being. Well, queen f3, possibly a mistake. b4. I don't know whether white thought he could answer b4 with rook d1, but he was soon disabused of that fact, as black now played the excellent move b takes c3. And, well, unfortunately for Savalainen, he's got to resign this position, which is in fact what he did. Trouble is, when he takes on d2 here, we take with the pawn, threatening to queen. The queen must drop back to stop the pawn from coming on, and then just knight f2 or knight e3. So that was another very thematic game, and also quite an instructive game from our perspective. The way Sagaf developed his forces, then castled on the queen side, that was excellent stuff. My next game features a little used but very dangerous white alternative in this burn variation that black players have to know about. And to highlight the possibilities, I've chosen a game from the Bunratty Masters tournament in 2005 between IM Sam Collins and Grandmaster John Nunn. Of course, we all know John Nunn has authored several excellent books on the Pirc defence. Guess in this game, Collins was just trying to catch him out, playing a very unusual move. And that unusual move is the immediate e5. Very rare and easy to overlook because, well, normally against the Pirc defence, you know, white wouldn't be able to get away with such an aggressive thrust early on, and particularly when the black bishop still resides on f8. What is white up to? Well, this is a dangerous idea, and white is basically inviting black to swap the queens off. He's arguing that c6 and b5 weaken the queen side, and with the queens off the board, he can probe the black queenside pawns. So black has to be careful here, and in particular, I don't think he should be in too much of a hurry to exchange queens, unless it suits him. Now in this game, Nunn plays the combative move b4. But I'm going to suggest a totally new move here, h6. I've run this through the engines, and it doesn't seem too bad for black. So if you want to counter the surprise with a surprise of your own, you can try this move h6. And let's just take a look now at some lines. Well, it's pretty clear that bishop takes f6, e takes f6 isn't troubling to black at all. I really believe in black's position now. He's got the dark squared bishop. So that doesn't cut the mustard. If white plays bishop e3 in this position, then I think we go knight g4. And if knight f3, we simply snap that bishop off. Knight takes e3, queen takes e3. And again, black has the powerful dark squared bishop to use as the game progresses. So again, this doesn't really cut the mustard for white. Going back, bishop f4. Well, in this variation, I think that black should probably take the pawn on e5 and acquiesce to the exchange of queens, because he gets the free hit, knight h5. It seems paradoxical to allow white the chance to take on d8 here, but black's king is quite useful in the middle, and after bishop e3, bishop g7, f4 and now g5, again black has his fair share of counterplay. So going back to h6 one more time, it looks like this is a decent move. Now white can take on f6. Well, we take on g5. In all these lines, black acquires the dark squared bishop. So one can believe in his position. So that's just a possibility to think over after to face this line. Mind you, the line Nunn plays in the game isn't so bad either. He plays b4. Clearly, if the knight moves on c3, the black knight is going to hop into e4. So white's got to continue with forcing moves here. He takes on f6, we take on c3. Collins took on c3 with the queen. He takes f6. And now we reach quite an interesting position. Black has voluntarily smashed up his pawn structure, but in return he's got open lines. So for instance, if white were to go bishop f4 here, bishop g7, castles on the queen side, castles on the king side, a very sharp struggle is about to commence, where a rapid attack is the order of the day for both sides. White's queen slightly misplaced. Against that, black has slightly worse pawns. On the other hand, black has the possibility of attacking white along the b file, and he's also got rook e8 in the bank as well. So I imagine this position isn't too bad for black, and that's probably what Nunn thought at the board. Going back, Collins chooses a sharp move in the game. He plays the immediate d5. This looks good, because black's got to sacrifice the c6 pawn for the time being in order to get castles. But now the move c7 I don't think is working that well because of queen e7 check. With this move, black recuperates and ends up with quite a nice position after f5, queen c4, and now knight to a6. Black's getting the pawn back, and he's got lovely open lines for his pieces. So I imagine this is roughly level, with perhaps black slightly for choice. So going back to the game, Collins played bishop to e3. Black played f5. Queen went to a3, and now black took on c6. Castles, and now d5. So again, it's freedom of movement versus the slightly better pawn structure. Now Collins moved in with queen c5. Again, a move which looks good because it's a double hit on the knight and the pawn at d5. But none was ready for this. Queen to f6. c3, and now typical disruptive tactics, f4. Before white gets developed, none is attacking white, preventing him from just getting developed normally and going to town on the d5 pawn. And I think suddenly, you know, white's position isn't that great anymore. He tried bishop d4. Black took. Now he's got this powerful bishop once again. Queen e7. Well, if white comes this far, he's got to basically take the pawn, I think, and hope that he can survive the black attack. But now comes a crunching blow. Bishop takes c3. I'm sure perhaps Collins had underestimated this move. The point of it is that if the bishop is taken, queen a3 check causes a terrible stir in white's camp. Bishop f5 check comes after that, and then some sort of pin on the d file. So Collins continued with queen d6. Nunn took the queen off and played bishop e5. And now I think we can safely say that black is better. Massive advantage in development, and the two bishops ready to rake the white king. Collins is struggling to get his pieces out. Knight c3. This is an attempt to buy black off with a pawn. Nunn sees no reason to reject the offer of a pawn. Plays his rook back to c5. This really should be a pawn up without tears, but it's more than that actually. It's also an attack against the white king. So it's no surprise that after king a1, black had a tactical stroke here, and that was the crunching move bishop takes a2. Now if king takes a2, rook a5 is mate, and if rook a6 as played, bishop d5, well, Collins resigned. I don't think, going back to the opening variation, you're going to have to face e5 that often, but when you do, you can play Nunn's move b4, or you might like to try my unplayed suggestion, my completely new idea here, h6. Both seem satisfactory. Now it's obvious that when white deploys his pieces against the Pirc, he's got pretty much a free hand in how he sets them out. And he may just revert to what we call natural methods. He doesn't play any sort of system. He just gets the pieces out and hopes that something's going to turn up. Well, a good example of this in the Bishop G5 system comes from the Corsica Open tournament in 1999 between a French player, Jean-Renaud Lagune, and the Grandmaster Artasius Minassian. And it's useful, finishing off this section on Bishop G5, to just see a game where white plays perhaps the most natural moves in the world. Instead of this f4 business, he just puts his queen on d2, plays his knight out to f3, b5, and now brings the bishop out to d3. We've seen this once before in this section, but perhaps in this game white plays even more naturally here, just sticking with the move bishop h6. As we know, black should play bishop g4 here. Takes on a g7, and now white plays, how can I put it, club player's move here. He just plays queen e3. He's initiated his primary idea of taking off the dark square bishop, and now he just plays his queen up to e3 to avoid any damage to his pawn structure on the king side. Moreover, white can castle on either side. So it's just a temptation to think in this position that black is slightly worse. Well, he may well be infinitesimally worse, but it's going to be instructive to see how Minassian handles the black side and comes out on top in the end. In actual fact, in reality, I don't think white has any sort of significant advantage here whatsoever, and it's an integral component of black's plan to take off that knight, to get rid of this pesky bishop which can get in the way, clog up the development of the queen side, and now to stake a claim in the centre with e5. So this is a good way to play the position as black, and as you can see, he's avoided any congestion. He's got some nice space on the queen side due to the pawn on b5, and the pawn on e5 has enabled him to establish this foothold in the centre. So black has equalised, and now the question is, what does he do with it? Well, white may have some positional problems here, and they come from this bishop on d3. You really don't want a bishop in your position looking at a central pawn the whole game. The bishop on d3 is very good protecting that pawn on e4. But in all other respects, it's poorly placed. It's blocking the d-file, stopping a white rook from coming into the game. So it makes sense for white to try and get that bishop somehow into the game. So if I was white, I would certainly be thinking about a move like a4, trying to get that bishop going, or maybe even c4, which explains black's next move, excellent move, rook b8. That move is prophylaxis against c4 and a4. It forces white to think about his queenside before he can get this bishop going. So very good from Minasian there. White goes c3, and now black plays c5, and now we see another point to the move rook b8. The rook necessarily protects the b pawn as a prelude to c5. Now black is thinking about counterplay on the queen side with moves like queen b6 and then maybe b4. So white's position, it seems to me, over the last few moves has got slightly worse. Black's position seems to be getting better and better, move by move, and that is the hallmark of the strong player. They seem to be able to coordinate their pieces so as to improve their position move by move. Well, white pushes on, making his bishop ever worse, and now black continues to improve his game with c4 and knight c5. In a way, this highlights a very good way to play in the middle game when you can't see exactly what to do. I mean, black has no obvious way to proceed. I mean, he can develop, let's say, a plan of gradual improvement of the pieces and an eventual b4, but there's nothing tactical in the position. So Minasian just makes slight improvements, move by move, very slightly improving his position, just not making things worse, and allowing his opponent a bit of rope. I mean, the white player in this game is not weak, but he's not strong either. And so Minasian says, well, I will gradually improve my position. Let's see what you can come up with. And sure enough, given this rope, the weaker player tends to come up with planless play. That really is what King H1 is all about. I think white has some visions of playing f4 at some point, so he gets the king off the diagonal. But that seems a long way off. And black moves in with b4 immediately. And now comes another weak move by white, really. He plays this move g4, which, frankly, looks poor. Now, of course, white didn't have to play g4, but the fact is black has plenty of counterplay in this position anyway, and, well, certainly doesn't stand worse. If anything, I prefer black's position here. But g4 just makes it look horrible, because not only does white have to think about his poor bishop now, he's got to think about the pressure on the queen side. He's also got to think about his self-inflicted weaknesses on the king side. So black moves in with b3, and the point of that is to nail down the pawn at b2. Knight comes to a4 at some point, and that pawn on b2 is gone. So white continues with knight g3. Black takes on a2. g5, lunging forward, hoping for some play. Bishop takes a2, and now queen to a6. And that move is awkward for white, because black's got a double hit on the bishop and the pawn at b2. b4 was played by white. C takes b3, bishop b1, a rather desperate sequence of moves. The complete absence of play on the king side due to this pathetic bishop and the fact that white's blocked lines there doesn't help either. And white continues to experience severe difficulties now after rook b3. Well, I think white's just lost. Rook g1. Is there any threat? Can't see anything. Knight f5 doesn't seem to work. There's no check on f6. Knight h5 doesn't seem to be working. Black moves in for the kill with rook a1. So white basically plays his last card here. He plays knight to f5 check. I mean, he's got to do something like this and hope that, you know, the punch will land. But black just takes it. Grandmasters are pretty cold-blooded. If they can't see any direct threats, they just take things. Queen h5. Knight takes e4. Black's central counterplay is very powerful. Queen h6 check. This is the culmination of white's play. Rook takes e4. Well, rook takes b1. Unfortunately, that is the end of the affair. Black is going to take on g1 and queen is pawn. So rook takes b1, f takes e4, and this rather miserable experience for white ended here. So that was a typical game, really, where black outplayed white, and it's a good way to end our section on the Burns system, because it just shows you that white just can't rely on his natural development to see him through against the Perk. Black has counterplay. Points to remember about this game? Well, please do remember the idea of getting rid of this light squared bishop. And, even if your fianchetto bishop comes off the board, you've still got a perfectly good game with the central counter e5 and knight bd7. By these means, Menashen was able to outplay Lagunis in this game. To finish off with then, another system for white. Well, whether you can call it a system or just a variation on a theme, I'm not sure. But it's the line where white plays his bishop out to f4 early rather than e3 or g5. The system may be introduced by playing bishop f4 now, or as in our illustrative game, by delaying it one move, playing knight f3 first. At any rate, it virtually comes to the same. The themes are the same. White can be thinking about queen d2 and bishop h6 as normal. There's not a lot of difference between this system and the others. Although I must say, as black, I'd be rather more pleased to see white put his bishop on f4, because I feel the bishop is exposed on this square. I mean, black can think about e5 himself at some moment, if the circumstances are right. He could also be thinking about a well-timed knight h5. But, that move only becomes effective under certain circumstances. At any rate, I'm pleased to see the bishop on f4. And now comes our featured game. Leandro Garcia Luengo versus Santiago Alonso, played in Madrid in 2010. Black is an international master, and he played knight c6. Well, that's a provocative move, quite in the spirit of the Pirc modern. I think it's a good move under these specific circumstances. I think with the bishop on f4, black is now thinking about playing e5 at the right moment, and the knight on c6 contributes to that plan. Queen d2 was played by white, and black played another fluid move here, bishop g4. So bishop comes out to g4, that's good, it eases any traffic jam on the queen side, and black is thinking about bishop takes f3. White moves in with d5, hoping that this is going to be inconvenient for black. Black plays back, quite in the spirit of the Pirc modern, to b8. This might look retrograde, but black is going backwards to come forwards later, as after castles on the queen side, he plays c6. That's an excellent move facilitating counterplay. The pawn on d5 is not that useful to white. In fact, it helps black get his action together. And, well, c6 lets the queen out and bites on d5. White moved in with bishop h6. Again, this is a very good illustrative game to show, because these are moves that most average players would play. The whole point of this bishop and queen battery on the dark squares is to go bishop h6 and take out black's fianchetto bishop. Well, this game will demonstrate beyond doubt that this is not such an effective procedure, and black can fight against it. Bishop e2 was answered by queen b6, another accurate deployment, attacking f2. And now white's got to play queen h4, really. I mean, I don't think he wants to play rook f1 in this position. That would be an absolutely horrible place for the rook. But even after queen at h4, bishop takes f3, and now black is perfectly okay. In fact, black is slightly better in this position, I think. I just like black's flexibility here. Rook's coming to c8 soon. In fact, it happened immediately in the game. And now black has definite counterplay on the queen side, without any shadow of a doubt. So white plays f4. C takes d5, knight takes d5, and now queen a5, attacking the pawn at a2. King b1, and now queen a4, another very forcing move, with black attacking pawns on e4 and c2. White took on f6, and bishop came to d3, after which black castled. So perfectly played to here by black, I think. A very good flexible position. The knight is potentially a better piece than the bishop here, and black's ongoing plan might be moves like rook c5 and then rook fc8, in typical dragon or Pirc modern style. So white thinks he should do something with f5, and black spies a tactical opportunity with knight d5. White takes on g6, and now black definitely is threatening knight b4, so white decides to stop it with a3. And now comes a very interesting moment in the game, because black launches a speculative attack with knight to c3 check. Now, I'm not actually sure whether this move's 100% sound, but it certainly does the business on white, who becomes very confused after this move. Just dropping back, I mean, black had a perfectly valid alternative here with rook c5. This seems to me to give black an excellent game with no risk, and, well, if I was black, that would be the way I would proceed. But knight c3 check, well, it just has an immediate impact, as white plays the cowardly move here, king a1. I mean, he's got to take that knight. It's ridiculous. He takes the knight. Okay, let's see what happens. Rook takes c3. Well, clearly, rook takes a3 is on the agenda, or queen takes a3, so white's king must do a runner. Rook takes a3, king d2, and now d5. Okay, well, I can see why white wouldn't like this continuation. You know, his king is being pushed around the board. But white definitely has some chances here. He had to go for this and take his chances after a move like rook g1. I mean, I think this would have been not only white's best chance to hold the position, but a chance to win it. So, in a sense, this move knight c3 was a rather risky continuation, but black got away with it in the game. White had to be brave and play this way. But okay, you know, over the board, sometimes you don't find these ideas. Anyway, king a1, well, it gets simpler now. Black took on d1, why not? And then took on c2. Very strong move indeed. Takes. Black re-sacrifices the exchange, but, well, the problem now for white is his material down. And white's attack on the king side is still a long way from hitting home. So f3 by white. King g7, keep the queen out of f6. Queen f4, and now e5. Queen h4, and now queen b3. So that's a very good move by black there, protecting the pawn on b7, and queen e6 is also on the agenda. So queen g4, white's thrashing around hoping something turns up. b5, h4, b4. A takes b4, queen a4 check. King b1, rook b8. In major piece positions, activity is the order of the day. So despite white's move h5 on the king side, black is coming first on the queen side with queen takes b4. White has to deal with the threat of mate. He plays rook g2, queen comes in, and now rook comes up to b4. H takes g6, it's all well calculated here. Queen, rook c4 check, king d3, rook d4 check, king c2, queen d1 check. White resigns. Mate next move, king c3, queen d3, checkmate. So I think there's no reason to suppose, just going back to the opening now, that the bishop on f4 is any better placed than it is on e3 and g5. Ponomarev, among strong grandmasters, has used this variation with only moderate success in the past few years. And, well, you won't have to face it very often, I guarantee you. Santiago's method in this game, knight c6, looks very reasonable, to be followed by a quick bishop g4. That seems to be a pretty good antidote to bishop f4.